Chapter 1. In the Shadow of Control. The world was a mosaic of sterile order. Each citizen, from birth, was wrapped in the invisible threads of a meticulously regulated existence. Streets were silent, buildings were uniform, and colors were muted to an extent that even a passing shade seemed rebellious. The only sounds that punctuated the silence were the hum of machinery and the distant, rhythmic droning of instructions broadcasted on sleek black screens embedded in the walls of every room, every hallway, every public space. They pulsed with directives, subtle reminders of the omnipresent authority that loomed over every thought, every action, and every heartbeat. In this world, emotions were deemed dangerous. They were variables that disrupted the precise calculations of productivity and obedience, and love, if ever felt, was nothing more than a relic of the past, relegated to the shadowy recesses of forgotten history. Citizens were taught that passion led to chaos and that attachment led to weakness. To desire was to betray the common good. To yearn was to step outside the boundaries of safety. The protagonist, a young woman with a soft glow in her eyes that betrayed her otherwise stony exterior, knew this truth all too well. She understood the weight of compliance, for it had been woven into her since her earliest memories. Her name, officially recorded as number E549, was forgotten by those around her. She herself struggled to remember it at times, her identity slowly eroded by years of rigid expectations. But within her, buried deep under layers of discipline and control, a spark persisted, flickering faintly, like a stubborn ember that refused to be snuffed out. Each day was a precise sequence of actions. She awoke at dawn to the cold light of her single-room dwelling, dressed in the regulation gray uniform, and consumed a tasteless ration as her morning meal. Then, she joined the other citizens in perfect formation, flowing through the city's corridors like a silent, colorless river, each step choreographed by the authority that watched over them. The people moved as one, their eyes vacant, their faces devoid of expression. But her mind was not empty. Every step she took, every mechanical task she performed, was an act of survival. The yearning within her was a quiet rebellion, and each day, it became harder to ignore. She had learned to mask it, to dull her gaze, to let her shoulders slump slightly, mimicking the others around her. Yet her heart beat fiercely, straining against the confines of her life. One day, as she performed her assigned duties in the sterile confines of the data collection sector, she found herself staring at the screen before her, fingers suspended above the keys. Lines of information scrolled by, data devoid of emotion, just numbers and facts feeding into the vast machine that governed them all. But she felt something simmering inside, a defiance so subtle, so easily missed, and yet powerful enough to set her whole being alight. Her fingers itched to create, to express, to break free. It was in these moments, when the hum of the machines around her seemed to soften and the weight of her reality bore down heavily, that her thoughts wandered to the unknown. She longed for a connection, a touch, a glance, anything that would make her feel alive. In her mind, she painted scenes she had never seen, of places beyond the towering walls and watchful cameras, where laughter echoed and hands intertwined freely. As her shift ended, she filed out with the others, heading toward her next assignment. But as she walked, she felt a sensation unlike any she had felt before. It was as if something unseen tugged at her, guiding her gaze down a narrow, seldom used corridor. She glanced around, making sure the others were ahead and out of sight, and then, almost involuntarily, she turned, slipping into the shadows of the passageway. The corridor was dimly lit, and the walls seemed closer here, bearing remnants of something old and forgotten. A faded poster hung on the wall, its colors washed out, but she could still make out the image of two figures standing close, their eyes locked on each other. The sight startled her. a jolt of something unfamiliar coursing through her veins. She knew what this was, a forbidden image, one that had escaped the purge of artifacts from the past. The figures in the poster seemed connected in a way she had never seen, and yet something deep within her recognized it instinctively. She felt her heart quicken, and in that moment, she knew she wasn't alone in her rebellion. There were others, hidden somewhere in the labyrinth of this cold, emotionless world, who shared her defiance. Somewhere, there were others who yearned to feel. The thought sent a shiver down her spine, a strange sensation, equal parts fear and exhilaration. She quickly pulled herself back, regaining her composure as she resumed her steps, merging seamlessly with the flow of citizens in the main hallway. But something had changed. In that fleeting encounter with the past, a piece of herself that she had long suppressed was awakened. She had seen evidence of a connection she had only ever imagined, and now, she could no longer be satisfied with the empty routines and soulless tasks that filled her days. Returning to her room that night, she lay in the dim glow of the single light above her bed, her mind replaying the image on that poster. She couldn't sleep. The weight of her desire, no longer something she could ignore, now pressed down on her chest, filling her with an ache so potent it felt as if she might burst. And though she knew the consequences, though she understood the risk, she resolved that she would find a way to feel the connection she had glimpsed in that forgotten corridor. The decision sent a thrill through her, a rebellion she felt even in her heartbeat as it raced against the silence of the room. She had crossed a line, one she could never uncross. The shadow of control had loosened its grip, if only by a fraction. And in that tiny, precious sliver of freedom, she felt alive. Chapter 2. A glimpse beyond the rules. The days began to blur together, each one bearing the same oppressive stillness, each filled with the monotonous rhythm of life within the confines of her assigned tasks. The protagonist, who once moved through her days with practiced indifference, found herself unsettled by the quiet rebellion that had begun to stir within her. It was as though the image she had seen, a simple, faded poster hidden in the shadows of an abandoned corridor, had breathed new life into her world, unveiling a forbidden reality that pulsed beneath the surface of her structured existence. She moved carefully, masking her thoughts and emotions, her gaze devoid of the spark that now simmered beneath. Yet, in the quiet hours, when her body was locked into the mindless rhythm of her duties, her mind drifted, wandering into the unknown. Her imagination traced the contours of that forbidden connection she had glimpsed. She would catch herself picturing the figures on the poster, the intensity in their eyes, the silent understanding that bridged the space between them. In these daydreams, she sensed an unnamed power, a force unshackled by the weight of rules and expectations, a freedom so raw it filled her with equal parts fear and fascination. Her mornings remained unchanged. She awoke to the same dim light, dressed in her uniform, and ate her bland ration. Yet each action now held a subtle defiance. In her quiet moments, she wondered what it would feel like to live without the authority's silent hand pressing down on every thought, every breath. She wondered what it would feel like to make a choice, a real choice, for herself. And the yearning that had once been a distant ember was now a fierce blaze, consuming her from within, even as she fought to keep it hidden. On one of these days, as she walked the long corridors to her next assignment, she found herself moving slower than usual, her steps lingering on the cold, polished floors. The air in the corridor was heavy with the scent of sterilization, the faint metallic tang that clung to everything within these walls. But in her mind, she imagined what the world beyond might smell like. An air untouched by machinery and sterilization, filled with scents that spoke of life, of nature. She allowed herself to wonder what it would feel like to step outside the walls, to stand in a place untouched by control. Her curiosity grew with each passing day. She began to study the faces around her, noting how each one mirrored the same blank expression. They were masks of compliance, empty vessels molded by the authorities' design. Yet, sometimes, she saw flickers of something deeper. An exhaustion in someone's eyes, a glimmer of recognition in a passing glance, almost imperceptible yet unmistakable to those who knew to look. Could they feel it too? She wondered. The longing, the ache for something beyond this shadowed existence? Her heart raced at the thought. She wasn't alone in this silent rebellion, in her search for something more. But she knew better than to reach out. The risk was too great. One misstep, one moment of vulnerability, and she would be stripped of everything, her soul erased from the fabric of this society. And yet, the knowledge lingered, like a secret shared only with the darkness, as she returned to her duties each day. Days slipped into weeks, and soon, her desire to break free became a tangible thing, as real as the walls that enclosed her. She began taking longer routes to her assigned posts, exploring the labyrinthine corridors and hidden passageways, always watching for those fleeting remnants of a forgotten past. Sometimes, she stumbled upon faded markings etched into the walls, symbols she didn't fully understand but felt drawn to, as if they held pieces of a world that had once existed outside the control of the authority. And it was on one of these detours, in the quiet hours of early morning, that she found herself in an area of the complex she had never seen before. The hallway was dimly lit, the walls worn and scarred, as though this place had been long abandoned. She glanced around, her pulse quickening, as she moved further down the corridor, her footsteps echoing softly against the cold floor. At the end of the hallway, she found herself facing a door, rusted and slightly ajar. Her hand trembled as she pushed it open, her heart pounding as she stepped inside. The room was small, bathed in a faint, golden glow that seemed to filter through a crack in the wall. Dust floated in the air, illuminated by the light, and she felt as though she had stepped into another world, a world untouched by the harsh sterility of her everyday life. Her gaze fell upon a collection of items scattered across a table in the corner. Old books, worn and faded, their covers cracked from age, and scraps of paper covered in handwriting, a language she barely recognized. She reached for one of the books, her fingers trembling as she brushed the surface. She opened it carefully, the pages brittle beneath her touch, and stared at the words before her, their meaning slowly unfurling in her mind. The book was a diary, a record of thoughts and feelings, written by someone who had once lived in a world where emotions were allowed to flourish. As she read, a strange warmth spread through her chest, a feeling so foreign and yet so deeply familiar that she nearly gasped. The words spoke of love, an intense, consuming love that had bound two souls together, transcending time and space, unshaken by the limitations of the physical world. She couldn't fully comprehend it, but she felt its power, the raw, unfiltered energy of a connection that defied all logic and reason. It was a love born from freedom, a love that stood in opposition to everything her society represented. In that moment, something within her shifted. She felt as though she had awakened from a long, dreamless sleep, her senses alive and humming with new awareness. This love, this connection, whatever it was, had become her purpose, a light to guide her through the darkness of her reality. She knew she couldn't go back to the way things were. She had seen too much, felt too much, to return to a life of silence and compliance. But she was also acutely aware of the risks. The authorities' reach was vast, its surveillance inescapable. Every citizen was watched, every movement tracked, every thought carefully measured. She knew that one wrong step, one act of defiance, could bring the full force of the system crashing down upon her. And yet, the knowledge did little to dampen the fire that had been ignited within her. As she left the room, Carefully closing the door behind her, she felt a strange sense of purpose settle over her. She no longer felt like a passive observer, a mere cog in the machine of society. She had become something else, something dangerous, something powerful. She had become a seeker of truth, a bearer of secrets that the authority could never understand. The world around her remained unchanged, still bound by the rules and regulations that had governed her entire life. But within her, a revolution had begun, a rebellion as silent as the unspoken thoughts that now filled her mind. She no longer saw her life as a series of tasks to be completed. She saw it as a journey, a path leading her ever closer to the truth, to freedom, to love. And though she knew the road ahead would be fraught with danger, she welcomed it, her heart steady, her resolve unbreakable. For the first time, she understood what it meant to be alive, not merely to exist, but to feel, to dream, to hope. And in that understanding, she found a strength she had never known, a strength that would carry her through the darkest of nights and the harshest of trials. She returned to her room that night, her mind alive with new possibilities, her heart burning with a fierce, unyielding determination. She knew she was no longer alone, and she knew that somewhere, hidden within the shadows of this world, others shared her defiance. And though she couldn't yet see them, she felt their presence, a silent, invisible network of souls bound by a common purpose. And as she lay in the darkness, she made a silent vow to herself. She would find them. She would find those who dared to feel, those who believed in the power of connection, in the strength of love. And together, they would carve a new path, a path that defied the authorities' grip and led to a world where freedom and individuality could flourish once more. Chapter 3. The Echo of Forbidden Emotions. The morning light felt different, sharper somehow, as if her very perception had shifted overnight. The protagonist had spent the hours in a restless haze, replaying the images from the forgotten room over and over in her mind. Each page she had turned, each word she had read, had stirred something deep within her, a yearning she had never known was possible, a hunger for a reality beyond the strict confines of her world. As she walked through the corridors that morning, she found herself observing every detail with fresh eyes. The walls, once only a backdrop to her daily tasks, now felt like barriers, thick, cold barriers keeping her from a world she couldn't see but could now feel. The gray uniforms, the regulated steps, the low hum of machinery, all seemed stifling, hollow imitations of life. Her hands moved mechanically, performing the tasks she had been assigned, but her mind was elsewhere, fixated on the books, on the hidden symbols, on the world she had glimpsed but could not yet touch. She replayed fragments of the diary in her mind, the scrawled handwriting that had spoken to her of freedom, of passion, of a life untethered. The words had come alive in her memory, each phrase a mantra of rebellion, each line a call to break free from the suffocating conformity. Her heart pounded with a fierce determination, a quiet fire building within her. She could feel her pulse racing as she moved, her thoughts sharp and daring. She longed to return to the hidden room, to delve deeper into its secrets, to understand the lives of those who had dared to live differently. But she knew that her actions would not go unnoticed for long. Surveillance was everywhere, and she was only one slip away from suspicion. Yet, even with this threat looming over her, she could not ignore the pull. The more she tried to suppress it, the stronger it grew, like an unquenchable flame that refused to be smothered. She began to linger in certain corridors, her eyes scanning every inch of the walls, searching for hidden markings, symbols, anything that might lead her to others who felt as she did. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was not alone in her defiance, that somewhere, in the shadows, others harbored the same quiet rebellion. In these moments of searching, she sensed something greater at work, as if an invisible network pulsed beneath the surface of her world, connecting those who dared to feel. She had read once, in the book's pages, about the power of connection, a bond that went beyond words, beyond the visible, something intangible yet undeniable. And as she moved through the corridors, she felt this power, felt it guiding her, urging her to keep searching. One day, as she walked down an unfamiliar hallway, she noticed a faint line etched into the wall, barely visible but unmistakably deliberate. She glanced around, her heart racing, before pressing her fingers to the mark, tracing its jagged edges. It felt like a signal, a silent message left for those who knew how to look. She followed it, allowing her intuition to guide her, turning down a series of winding corridors until she reached a narrow doorway she had never noticed before. The room beyond was dimly lit, shadows pooling in every corner. She stepped inside cautiously, her eyes adjusting to the darkness. It was smaller than the first room, but similar in its secrecy, its atmosphere thick with the weight of hidden knowledge. Against the far wall, she saw a shelf lined with objects, each one different, each one carefully placed as though arranged by someone with a purpose. Books, scraps of paper, even small trinkets, all gathered in silent defiance of the authorities' ban on personal possession. Her hands trembled as she reached for a small, rusted pendant hanging from the edge of the shelf. The metal was cold against her skin, but she felt a warmth spreading through her, as if the pendant itself carried the memory of the person who had once worn it. She held it tightly, feeling a strange kinship with whoever had left it behind, a bond formed across time and silence. Next to the pendant was a piece of paper, folded and worn, its edges frayed from age. She unfolded it slowly, her eyes widening as she read the words scrawled across the page. It was a poem, a declaration of love and defiance, written in a hand that trembled with emotion. The words spoke of longing, of a passion that refused to be silenced, a love that stood in direct opposition to the sterile, emotionless world around her. Reading the poem felt like discovering a piece of herself she had never known existed. The verses resonated with her, each line echoing her own unspoken desires. She closed her eyes, letting the words sink into her mind, filling her with a sense of purpose she had never known before. This love, this rebellion, was no longer just a concept, an abstract ideal. It was a reality she could touch, a truth she could carry with her, a guiding light in the darkness of her world. With a deep breath, she folded the paper and slipped it into her pocket, a small act of defiance that filled her with exhilaration. She knew she was taking a risk, knew that the authorities would see it as a betrayal if they found out. But she no longer cared. She had tasted freedom, felt its raw, unfiltered power, and she knew there was no turning back. In the days that followed, she became more careful, more guarded, but her resolve only grew stronger. She carried the pendant and the poem with her, hidden beneath her uniform, a secret symbol of her rebellion. Each time she felt the weight of the authorities' gaze, each time she sensed the eyes of the enforcers on her, she reminded herself of the words on the page, of the bond she now shared with those who had come before her. Her life took on a new rhythm, each task, each duty performed with a sense of duality. Outwardly, she was the same compliant citizen, her actions measured, her demeanor controlled, but within, she was a storm, a force of nature held in check only by her own will. She had become a vessel for the fire of rebellion, a living testament to the power of love, of hope, of a future that lay beyond the walls of her world. And as the days passed, she felt herself growing stronger, her fear replaced by a fierce determination. She no longer saw herself as a victim of her circumstances. She was a fighter, a warrior in a battle fought not with weapons, but with courage, with resilience, with the unbreakable bonds of human connection. She was a part of something greater, a movement that existed in the shadows, a network of souls bound by a shared belief in the power of love and the right to choose. One night, as she lay in the silence of her room, she felt the weight of her decision pressing down on her. She knew the road ahead would be difficult, knew that the price of freedom was high, but she also knew that she could no longer turn back. She had made her choice, and she would follow it to the end, no matter the cost. And as she drifted into sleep, she felt a sense of peace settle over her, a calmness that came from knowing she was finally living her truth. She was no longer a prisoner of her own mind, no longer bound by the invisible chains of fear. She was free, in a way the authorities could never understand, and she knew that no matter what happened, they could never take that freedom from her. Chapter 4. Awakening to the Hidden World. Days melded together in the meticulously controlled rhythms of her world, but for the protagonist, time had gained new significance, each passing hour a step further into the depths of her secret rebellion. She moved through her daily tasks with precision, keeping her face expressionless and her movements contained, blending into the masses of compliant citizens who carried out their duties without thought or deviation. Yet beneath this facade, her mind buzzed with new energy, her heart alive with a sense of purpose. Her thoughts often lingered on the underground figure she had read about, a person described only in rumors, an enigmatic leader among the few who dared to fight back. This mysterious figure had inspired whispers of hope among the scattered symbols, a presence as elusive as smoke yet as powerful as the ocean tides. It was said that they moved in shadows, communicating through a web of hidden codes and signals, working tirelessly to expose the secrets of the regime. The protagonist felt an undeniable connection to this figure, even though she had never met them, nor did she know if they even existed outside of hopeful tales. And yet, her instincts urged her to believe in them. Every time she closed her eyes, she could feel the pull, as if a thread bound them together in a way that defied logic. One evening, as she walked the narrow corridors on her way back to her quarters, she noticed a small slip of paper lying in her path. At first glance, it seemed inconspicuous, easily mistaken for debris left behind in the rush of daily movements. But something about the way it lay on the ground, almost deliberate in its placement, made her pause. She crouched down, heart hammering as she carefully picked it up, casting a wary glance around to make sure she was unseen. It was folded neatly, the edges worn but the creases sharp. With trembling fingers, she opened it, revealing a single, short phrase scrawled across the page in hurried handwriting. "Trust the darkness, for only there will the truth reveal itself." Her breath caught, and she quickly tucked the note into her pocket, feeling a surge of both fear and exhilaration. The message felt intimate, as though left for her specifically, as if someone knew of her silent rebellion and had reached out through the veil of secrecy that shrouded her world. In the solitude of her room that night, she sat on her bed and unfolded the note once more, examining every letter, every tiny stroke of the pen. The words seemed to pulse with hidden meaning, a code she had yet to decipher. She could almost feel the hand that had written it, someone else who had dared to defy the system, someone who understood the risks. The note felt like a lifeline, a link between herself and a hidden network of like-minded individuals who, like her, had tasted the forbidden fruit of freedom and yearned for more. The following days became a blur of watchfulness and anticipation. She moved through her duties with an air of calm detachment, but every fiber of her being was tuned to the smallest details, the slightest hint of anything out of the ordinary. She scanned the faces of her fellow citizens, searching for any sign of recognition, a subtle nod, a knowing glance. But there was nothing. Only the same impassive expressions, the same blank stares, the same mechanical obedience. Yet, her persistence paid off. A few days later, she found another note. This one tucked into the narrow crack of a wall she passed every day on her route to work. It was small, almost too small to notice, but her eyes had become sharp, her senses heightened. She slipped it into her pocket without hesitation, waiting until she was safely back in her room before unfolding it. This note was shorter, simpler. There is a meeting tonight. The 5th floor, East Wing. Midnight. Her heart raced as she read it, and she folded it back up with trembling fingers. A meeting. The very idea was both thrilling and terrifying. She had heard whispers of gatherings, stories of secret assemblies where those who questioned the regime could share their thoughts, their plans, their hope, but she had never imagined she would be part of one. At midnight, she crept from her room, her footsteps silent as she navigated the shadowed corridors. The building was still, every light dimmed, the usual hum of machinery reduced to a soft whisper. Her heart pounded as she moved, each step an act of defiance, each turn an echo of her growing courage. The air was thick with the weight of her decision, every corner she turned bringing her closer to the unknown, closer to a truth she could no longer ignore. Finally, she reached the east wing of the 5th floor. She paused, letting her eyes adjust to the darkness, her senses attuned to any movement. Then, as if drawn by an invisible force, she spotted a faint glow at the end of the corridor. It was coming from a room partially concealed behind a wall, its door slightly ajar. She approached cautiously, her heart pounding, every nerve on edge. Inside, the room was dimly lit, a handful of candles casting flickering shadows across the walls. She saw several figures standing in a loose circle, their faces obscured by the shadows, each one as silent and tense as she was. The air was thick with a quiet intensity, a shared purpose that bound them together even in the silence. She took a step closer, feeling a surge of connection as she stood among them, her heart swelling with the realization that she was no longer alone. These were her allies, her comrades in the fight for freedom. She could feel it in the way they stood, the way they breathed, each one of them united by an unspoken bond that transcended words. One of the figures stepped forward, a tall, slender individual whose presence radiated calm strength. The figure raised a hand, and the others immediately fell silent, their attention focused, their bodies still. The figure began to move slowly, each step deliberate, each motion filled with purpose. The candlelight flickered across their face, casting shadows that obscured their features, but the protagonist could sense the resolve in their gaze, feel the power of their conviction. In a fluid motion, the figure reached out and extended a small book toward her. She took it, her fingers closing around the worn cover, the rough texture grounding her in the reality of her choice. She looked down at the book, feeling its weight, sensing the history contained within its pages, the stories of those who had fought before her, the knowledge that had been passed down through the shadows. As she held the book, a sense of clarity washed over her, a newfound understanding of the path she had chosen. She was no longer just an observer, no longer a silent rebel hiding in the cracks of her world. She was a part of something greater, a movement that pulsed with the rhythm of defiance, a force that could not be contained. The figure raised their hand once more, signaling the end of the gathering. One by one, the members of the group melted back into the shadows, their footsteps soft and steady as they slipped away into the darkness. She followed suit, her heart racing with the knowledge of what she had become. She had crossed a line, stepped into a world of secrets and shadows, and there was no turning back. As she made her way back to her room, the book clutched tightly in her hands, she felt a strange calm settle over her. The fear that had once gripped her was gone, replaced by a quiet strength, a certainty that she was ready for whatever lay ahead. She had found her place, her purpose, her path, and she would follow it with every ounce of her being. And as the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, she knew that her life had changed forever. She was no longer a silent rebel, no longer a shadow in the night. She was a part of a movement, a spark in the darkness, a beacon of hope in a world that had forgotten what it meant to be free. Chapter 5. Secrets Beneath the Surface. Back in her small room, she sat on the narrow bed, her eyes transfixed by the worn, frayed book that lay in her hands. Its cover was faded, the title eroded by time and countless hands that had held it before hers. She traced her fingers along the edges, feeling the roughness of each page, the quiet testament to the resistance that had endured silently for so long. Every crinkle and crease seemed to whisper stories of courage, fragments of lives sacrificed in the name of freedom. When she opened the book, the scent of old paper filled the air, heavy with the weight of ages past. The first pages were filled with symbols she didn't recognize, codes, maps, sketches, and tiny notes written in the margins. It wasn't just a book. It was a tapestry of knowledge, a collection of thoughts and memories, a piece of history bound together in secrecy. She felt an electric thrill pulse through her, as though she was holding the very heartbeat of the underground in her hands. Turning the pages slowly, she came across a handwritten note scrawled across one of the corners. "Remember, true freedom lies in the courage to know yourself." The phrase stirred something deep within her, a feeling that resonated with the growing sense of rebellion that had taken root in her soul. In a world where individuality was stamped out, the call to know oneself was as radical as the desire for freedom itself. As she continued to read, the book guided her through stories of others who had come before her. Ordinary citizens who had dared to question, dared to feel, dared to imagine a life beyond the iron grip of control. The stories were written in fragments, each one painting a different picture of resistance. One entry, dated many years ago, spoke of a woman who had once worked as an informant, only to discover the harsh reality of the system. In her final entry, she wrote, "They cannot break a heart that has already found love." She couldn't help but imagine this woman, alone in her realization, surrounded by the unforgiving mechanisms of authority, yet finding an unbreakable strength within herself. The protagonist felt a strange kinship with this unknown woman, as if their paths were woven together through the pages of this clandestine history. In the days that followed, she pored over the book at every available moment, her mind absorbing its contents like parched soil drinking in the rain. The book had become her lifeline, a companion that fed her curiosity, her courage, and her growing resolve. She felt herself transforming with each new page she turned, each story she absorbed. It was as if the book was unlocking parts of her she had long forgotten, parts she hadn't even known existed. Hidden within the text were passages that read like instructions, directions for moving within the labyrinthine network of the underground. The book described how to recognize symbols etched into alleyway walls, how to interpret certain marks in a public square, and the specific days when it was safest to meet with others. She marveled at the ingenuity of the system, a clandestine world thriving right beneath the authorities' noses. One passage, marked with a small star, caught her attention. "When the stars align, follow the path of the river." She read the line over and over, trying to decode its meaning. The book had a way of speaking in riddles, its wisdom disguised in layers of metaphor and allegory. She wasn't certain what it meant, but she committed it to memory, feeling that it might hold importance later. Her solitary exploration of the book soon gave her courage to explore her city in new ways. She had once been just another citizen, moving through life in predictable, carefully controlled patterns. Now, however, she found herself looking at her surroundings with new eyes, seeking out the hidden symbols, the subtle markers that indicated safe passage, gathering points, and warning signs. One evening, as she walked along a crowded street, her gaze landed on a small, nearly invisible etching on the side of a building. It was a delicate spiral, barely noticeable, carved discreetly into the stone. She felt her heart race as she recognized it from the pages of her book. It was a sign of a gathering place. There, just beyond the surface of her world, lay the entrance to a hidden realm, a place where others like her sought refuge from the regime's suffocating reach. She hesitated, unsure if she was ready to plunge further into the underground's embrace. But a fierce resolve surged through her. Every step she had taken so far had brought her closer to this moment, closer to the pulse of rebellion that now thrummed through her veins. She knew there was no going back, not now, not ever. Later that night, she returned to the building, moving swiftly under the cover of darkness. She traced the spiral with her fingers, following the instructions she remembered from the book. Her fingers pressed against the cold stone, searching for a hidden latch or a secret entrance. After a few moments, she felt a slight give in the wall. With a faint grinding noise, a narrow door opened, just wide enough for her to slip through. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of damp stone and earth, a stark contrast to the sterile, regulated environment she was accustomed to. Flickering lights illuminated a narrow passageway that twisted and turned, descending into the bowels of the city. She moved forward, her footsteps echoing softly, each step a confirmation of her choice. At the end of the passageway, she found herself in a small, dimly lit room. The walls were covered in worn maps and scattered documents, each one detailing parts of the city she had never seen. Symbols she recognized from the book were painted on the walls, a language of rebellion that connected her to those who had come before her. She spent hours poring over the maps, memorizing routes and locations marked with symbols of safety or danger. There were places she'd walked by 1,000 times, unaware of the hidden meaning just beneath the surface. Each line, each dot, each coded word represented a piece of the puzzle, a fragment of the resistance that had taken root in the very fabric of her world. As dawn approached, she carefully replaced everything just as she'd found it. She slipped out of the hidden room, her mind buzzing with newfound knowledge, her heart heavy with the weight of her commitment. She knew now that there was no escaping the path she had chosen. The underground had claimed her, and she had willingly surrendered. In the days that followed, her view of the world shifted even further. She found herself reading between the lines of every interaction, every instruction handed down by the authorities. The book had shown her the undercurrents of resistance that flowed unseen, guiding her toward others who shared her unspoken dream of freedom. There was a risk in this knowledge, a constant danger that came with every glance, every coded message she deciphered. But she had found something stronger than fear, a purpose that filled her with an iron determination to continue, to fight, to resist. She was no longer a lone figure standing against the tide. She was a part of the tide itself, a current moving toward a future that, for the first time, held the promise of hope. The city around her felt both familiar and foreign, a place she had known her entire life, yet was only now beginning to understand. She realized that the journey she had begun was more than a quest for freedom. It was a journey to reclaim herself, to forge an identity separate from the shadows of control and conformity. And as she carried the book with her, hidden beneath her clothes, she felt as though she carried not only the weight of the past, but the spark of something new. It was the beginning of a flame, a silent rebellion that could not be extinguished, a legacy waiting to be born. Chapter 6. The Pull of Rebellion. The following days unfolded like a silent ballet, each step measured, each glance calculated. She became an actress in a play of her own making, crafting expressions and postures that shielded her inner thoughts. While she performed her daily duties with the same obedient efficiency expected of every citizen, her mind raced with a whirlwind of new insights and careful strategies. She moved through the city as if veiled, cloaked by the anonymity that life under the regime imposed on every individual. One day, While taking a familiar route home, she noticed a small object tucked into the crevice of a wall. A simple piece of folded paper, almost unnoticeable. Glancing around to ensure she was unobserved, she slipped it into her pocket, her heart racing with anticipation. Back in the safety of her room, she unfolded the note, her fingers trembling with a mix of curiosity and fear. The message was brief, written in the familiar coded script she had studied from the book. "Tomorrow night, the lanterns will lead you." She read the words repeatedly, committing them to memory. There was no signature, no identifying mark, only the knowledge that someone else was watching, waiting for her to find her way to them. She felt a strange mixture of relief and tension. At last, she was no longer alone in her rebellion. The next evening, she dressed carefully, choosing plain, dark clothing that would allow her to slip through the streets unnoticed. As dusk settled over the city, she made her way to the meeting place, her steps measured and purposeful. The streets were nearly deserted, their silence punctuated only by the distant hum of security patrols sweeping through neighborhoods. She kept her head down, walking with the same practiced detachment she had learned to wear like armor. After a while, she spotted it, a small lantern hanging from the side of a building, its dim glow casting a soft light onto the street. She paused, glancing around, but there was no one else in sight. Taking a deep breath, she stepped toward the lantern, noting a faint mark carved into the wall beneath it, a circle with a line slashed through the center. She recognized it as one of the symbols she had memorized, a sign of safe passage. Following the silent trail of lanterns, she moved through the winding alleys and hidden passages of the city, her senses heightened by the thrill of her clandestine journey. The lanterns led her away from the main streets, deeper into the heart of the city's hidden underbelly. She felt as though she was peeling back layers of her world, revealing a reality that lay just beyond the reach of those who walked through life with closed eyes. Finally, she arrived at the end of the trail. Before her stood a nondescript building, its windows darkened and its door unmarked. For a moment, doubt tugged at her thoughts. Was this a trap? Had someone discovered her secret and laid a snare for her? But the memory of the book, the stories of those who had dared to dream of freedom, gave her the courage to press forward. She pushed open the door and stepped inside, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. The room was small, sparsely furnished, with walls lined with shelves filled with books and papers. A map of the city, scrawled over with notes and markings, covered one wall. Her gaze settled on a figure standing in the corner, half hidden by shadows. The person stepped forward slowly, and she noticed that they wore a hood, their face obscured. A feeling of familiarity washed over her. She recognized the outline of the figure, the grace of their movements. It was him, the mysterious man she had seen in the alleyway that fateful night. His presence filled the room with a silent power, an intensity that seemed to resonate with her own hidden resolve. His eyes, the only part of his face visible beneath the hood, held a quiet strength, as if he understood the weight of every choice, every sacrifice. They stood there, merely looking at one another, an unspoken understanding passing between them. Though no words were exchanged, she felt as though she was seeing herself reflected in his gaze, a mirror of courage and vulnerability, of defiance and hope. He reached into his coat and handed her another piece of paper, smaller than the note she had found in the alley. She took it carefully, nodding her gratitude. Once back in her room, she unfolded the paper to reveal a list of locations and dates. It was a map of gatherings, places where members of the underground met in secret. The realization hit her with force. She was being invited into the heart of the resistance. Her thoughts swirled as she traced the lines on the paper, each name, each date representing an opportunity to connect with others who shared her vision. In the days that followed, she moved with a new purpose, carefully planning her attendance at these gatherings. The first was to take place in an abandoned warehouse on the edge of the city, a place long forgotten by the authorities and left to crumble under layers of dust and neglect. She arrived at the location, her heart pounding, the thrill of rebellion mingling with the fear of discovery. Inside, the air was thick with anticipation. Shadows flitted across the walls, the faces of strangers illuminated only by the faint glow of a few scattered candles. She kept to the edges of the room, watching as the others exchanged glances and nods, a silent network of communication built on trust and secrecy. Each person present was a part of something larger, bound by a shared desire to reclaim the freedom that had been stripped from them. As the gathering progressed, they listened as someone recounted tales of resistance, stories of small victories and setbacks, of courage in the face of relentless oppression. She felt a strange sense of belonging, a kinship with these people who had once been strangers, but who now felt like allies in her silent war against the system. By the end of the night, she had memorized the faces of those around her, their identities hidden but their spirits unmistakable. They were the heart of the underground, the lifeblood that kept the resistance alive. And as she left the gathering, slipping back into the shadows of the city, she knew that her journey had only just begun. She returned to her life by day as though nothing had changed, hiding her newfound knowledge beneath the surface. Yet, she felt the shift within herself, a quiet rebellion that grew stronger with each passing moment. She was no longer just a lone voice against the regime. She was part of a movement, a rising tide that sought to tear down the walls of control and conformity. As the weeks passed, she attended more gatherings, each one a vital connection to the underground network. With each meeting, her sense of purpose grew, and so did her resolve to fight for a future where love, freedom, and individuality could thrive. The lanterns, the symbols, the maps. All of them wove together a complex web of resistance, one that bound her to those who had come before and those who would follow. Her role in the rebellion was growing, her presence within the underground solidifying. She had found her allies in the shadows, a family bound not by blood, but by the unbreakable ties of shared hope and quiet defiance. And as she walked through the streets, slipping past the watchful eyes of the authorities, she felt the strength of those allies with her. A silent army standing side by side in the darkness, waiting for the day when their whispers would become a roar, and their rebellion would be more than just a shadow in the night. Chapter 7: Unraveling the Lies. The city never slept. Even beneath the cover of night, the hum of the regime's watchful eyes lingered in the air, as though the very streets were alive with the sense of being observed. The silence of the darkness felt artificial, suffocating, as if the city was a machine, constantly ticking, endlessly monitoring, with no room for freedom to breathe. But beneath the surface, in hidden pockets and forgotten corners, the rebellion pulsed with quiet determination. The protagonist, now a more entrenched part of the underground, found herself increasingly drawn into the intricate web of the resistance. Each night, each gathering, each meeting in secret locations fueled her growing sense of purpose. The people she met were both strangers and familiar faces, connected not by appearance, but by their shared drive to topple the oppressive regime that had kept them in chains for so long. There was a particular meeting that remained etched in her mind, one that marked a shift in her journey. The lanterns led her once again to an abandoned building, but this time, the atmosphere felt heavier, charged with an undeniable tension. She entered the room as usual, her steps quiet and deliberate, but the usual comfort of the familiar setting eluded her. The air felt thick with uncertainty, and the faces around her seemed different, distant, wary, as if something had shifted in their world. She made her way to the far corner, her eyes scanning the room. It was smaller than usual, the walls lined with faces she did not recognize. Yet there was something painfully familiar about the energy in the room. A quiet murmur of unease seemed to swirl around her like an invisible force. She could sense it, the calm before a storm. It didn't take long for the first signs to emerge. The door to the back room opened with a creak, and in stepped a figure. She didn't need to see their face to recognize them. The very presence of this person had a weight, a familiarity that tugged at her heart. It was him, the mysterious figure from the first meeting, the one whose presence had stirred something inside her from the very beginning. His arrival had always signaled a shift, a spark of something more intense, but this time, there was something off about it. His movements were less sure, his eyes darting to the corners of the room, his hand instinctively brushing his coat, as though checking for something. Something he wasn't sure was still there. The room fell into an eerie stillness as the figure walked further inside. It was a strange, quiet moment of recognition, the unspoken understanding between the two of them undeniable. Yet, something about the air had changed, and she could feel the growing discomfort from the others in the room. A subtle shift in the energy, a collective unease that rippled through the group, like the sudden realization that the ground beneath them had shifted. She watched him closely, trying to read the flicker of emotions crossing his face, but his expression remained a mask. The tension in the room thickened, the silent whispers of concern hanging in the air. The room's occupants exchanged glances, furtive, cautious, and she realized, with a chill running through her veins, that there were too many strangers here, too many faces she didn't recognize. Something had changed, and it wasn't just the unease she felt. Something more profound, something darker, had settled into the gathering. The figure she had once seen as a potential ally now felt like a ghost, a symbol of all that she had come to believe in, but who might no longer be what he seemed. Her instincts, honed from years of living in this controlled world, screamed at her. There was danger in the air, a sense that she had crossed a line she hadn't fully understood until now. As the night wore on, the tension in the room thickened. The murmurs grew more frantic, more hurried, as if the gathering had shifted from a meeting of resistance to one of fear and uncertainty. She could see the others, the ones she had come to know and trust, shifting their positions, their eyes flicking nervously toward the door, as though expecting someone to burst in at any moment. The shadows seemed to stretch longer in the room, darker, more oppressive. She could feel the weight of the secret they all carried, the knowledge that they were being watched, hunted. Every decision, every action, could be the one that would expose them all. She wasn't sure if they were waiting for something, perhaps an announcement, or perhaps a warning. But whatever it was, the waiting was unbearable. And then, it happened. A sudden sound broke the tense silence, a soft footstep, then another, followed by the unmistakable click of boots on the cold stone floor. She turned, her heart leaping into her throat, and saw it. The flash of an insignia, a symbol of the regime, the mark of the enforcers. They had come. In a flash, chaos erupted. The door burst open with a violent force, and in swept the enforcers, their eyes sharp, their movements precise. The room filled with a cold, metallic pressure, the sound of boots stomping against the stone floor, the low hum of weapons being drawn. In the confusion, she saw the figure. The one she had thought was an ally, dart toward the back door, his form disappearing into the shadows. But it wasn't fear in his eyes that she saw. It was something else, something darker, something that sent a ripple of horror through her chest. The enforcers were quick, methodical. They didn't care for the faces they saw, didn't care for the lives they ruined. They came with an unrelenting force, sweeping the room with practiced precision, capturing the rebels without hesitation. Her heart raced as she fought to remain still, to not make a sound, to not reveal herself. But in that moment, as she pressed her back against the cold wall, one thing became clear. The man she had trusted, The one who had been her first real connection in this forbidden world of resistance had betrayed them all. She felt the weight of that realization settle over her like a stone, suffocating and final. Her mind raced, heart pounding in her chest, as the enforcers moved through the room, each step bringing them closer to the truth she now knew. Her world had just changed, and there was no turning back. She wasn't sure how much time had passed, but eventually, the enforcers cleared the room. She was left alone in the darkness, the echoes of the footsteps fading into the distance. The betrayal hung in the air like smoke, and she was left to wonder whether she had been naive, too trusting in the hope of freedom. The weight of the loss pressed against her chest, and for the first time since she had joined the underground, she was unsure of what the future held. But one thing was clear: this was not the end. It was only the beginning of something far more dangerous, a journey that would push her to the limits of her loyalty, her courage, and her love. And she would fight until the end, no matter the cost. Chapter 8. A meeting cloaked in danger. The city's pulse had changed. The once constant hum of the regime's watchful presence now felt like a looming shadow, stretching over everything she had come to know. The protagonist stood at the edge of the city, her back against the cold, gray wall of a forgotten alley, watching the world unfold before her with a mixture of fear and determination. The betrayal had left its mark, sharp and unyielding, clawing at her heart with each breath. She had once believed in the strength of their cause, in the unity of the resistance. But now, everything seemed tainted, as though the very foundation beneath her feet was beginning to crumble. She had never been one to doubt, to question the things that felt right. But with each passing day, the weight of the uncertainty grew heavier, pressing against her chest until it was almost impossible to breathe. Every corner, every shadow, seemed a whisper of lies and deception. Every face she passed felt unfamiliar, even though she had once called them allies. The streets felt like a labyrinth now, filled with walls that closed in, trapping her in a maze of doubt. The night had fallen thick around the city, the darkness a blanket that smothered all light. It was the perfect time to move undetected, to slip through the cracks of a system that had taken so much from her. But tonight, the streets felt different. The air itself seemed to vibrate with tension, as if it too had been infected by the same doubt that plagued her mind. The protagonist made her way through the narrow streets, her footsteps muffled by the sound of the distant hum of the city's heartless machines. She kept her head down, eyes scanning the shadows, searching for something or someone that might provide answers. Every flicker of movement, every gust of wind, seemed to hold a threat. But it wasn't just the regime that frightened her anymore. It was the unknown that had taken root in her heart. She no longer knew who to trust. Her thoughts wandered back to the events that had unfolded in the hidden underground meeting. She could still see his face, the figure who had been her ally, the one who had promised freedom, the one who had made her believe in a cause larger than herself. His betrayal was sharp, as if someone had torn the fabric of their shared dream. It was more than just an act of selfishness. It was an act of destruction, one that had shattered her trust in everything. Her belief in love, in hope, in the possibility of change. All of it now seemed like a distant, unreachable dream. But she couldn't let herself fall into despair. The resistance still needed her, even if the trust between them was now fractured beyond repair. There were others, still loyal to the cause, still willing to fight for what they believed in. She had to keep moving, keep fighting. The price of failure was too great. She paused at the edge of a large square, the lights flickering dimly in the distance. In the center, a large monument loomed, a symbol of the regime's control, a monument to the twisted ideals that had suppressed so many for so long. The protagonist felt the familiar burn of anger rise within her, the same anger that had ignited her rebellion in the first place. It was an anger that fueled her, that pushed her forward, even when everything else seemed to be falling apart. She stood in the square for a moment, her gaze fixed on the monument, her mind racing with plans and possibilities. There was something she had to do, something to restore her sense of purpose, something to remind her that the fight was worth it. And then, as if guided by instinct, she moved. She knew what she had to do now. She couldn't afford to wait any longer. The longer she hesitated, the more she risked losing everything she had worked for. The risk of the unknown seemed small compared to the certainty of staying idle. She had to act, to keep pushing forward, no matter the consequences. The journey ahead would not be easy. She knew that. The enforcers would be watching, their eyes everywhere, their reach long and unforgiving. But she had come too far to stop now. She had seen too much, had felt too much, to simply turn back. And above all, she had learned something crucial. There was a cost to rebellion, a cost that wasn't always apparent until it was too late. The darkness deepened as she made her way toward the meeting point, the one she had agreed upon with the remnants of the resistance. Her mind raced as she thought of the mission ahead. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about something more, something deeper. It was about hope, about restoring the fragments of a world that had been torn apart. It was about doing what was right, even when the price seemed too steep. The alleyways blurred by as she moved swiftly through the city's veins, the lights growing dimmer as she reached the outskirts of the district. The tension was palpable now, thicker than the night air around her. Her senses were heightened. Every creak of a door, every rustle in the shadows, every distant hum of machinery setting her on edge. She felt as though the entire city was alive, watching her every move, waiting for her to slip up, waiting for her to falter. The meeting point was a small building tucked away behind a row of crumbling warehouses, almost hidden from sight. It was quiet, too quiet. She could see the dim flicker of light through a crack in the door. The shadows cast by the weak flame inside stretched long against the walls, moving like ghosts in the silence. Her heart pounded as she stepped closer, every part of her body alert, every nerve on fire. She knew this moment would change everything, but she wasn't sure how. Would she find the answers she was looking for? Or would this too be another illusion, another shattered dream? As she stepped inside, the warmth of the room embraced her, a stark contrast to the chill that had clung to her skin. The space was dimly lit, but she could make out the silhouettes of familiar faces. The people who had once been strangers now felt like family. Their presence was a comfort, but also a reminder of the cost of betrayal. There was no turning back now. She had made her choice, and with it came the weight of everything she had come to learn. The fight for freedom, for love, for a future outside the regime's grasp would not be easy. But it was a fight she would not abandon, not for herself, and not for the people she had come to call her own. As she stood in the doorway, waiting for what would come next, she realized that the journey ahead would be more difficult than anything she had faced before. But she also realized something else, that no matter what, she would not face it alone. Chapter 9. Hearts Defying Darkness. The city had grown colder. It was not the chill of the air or the absence of warmth that unsettled her, but the creeping realization that the heart of the city, once teeming with life, was now a silent, mechanical force. The streets were lined with faces that wore the same hollow expression, the same vacant eyes that reflected nothing of the world around them. The protagonist, however, had begun to see the cracks beneath the surface, the little glimmers of life that still fought to break free from the walls of suppression. She moved through the city, blending in like one of the countless faceless citizens, though every step felt like an act of rebellion. The uniform she wore, though it marked her as one of them, no longer felt like protection. It felt like a shackle. She knew the risk she took by stepping outside the boundaries of her assigned role. The risk of being caught, of being questioned, of being silenced forever. But these risks, in the end, felt smaller than the weight of her own silence, smaller than the complicit acceptance of the system that held them all captive. The underground movement had grown stronger, but its influence remained hidden, like embers beneath the ashes. She had met more of them in the shadows, felt the warmth of their hopes flicker in the dark corners of the world they inhabited. It was dangerous work, this covert resistance. Every day was an act of defiance, a step closer to discovery, a reminder that there was no such thing as safety when the enemy could be anyone. Any face in the crowd, any fleeting glance. The resistance had its leaders, those who planned and strategized. But it was in the quiet moments, the moments of shared breath and exchanged glances, that the true power of the movement lived. There, in those hushed silences, the protagonist's heart beat in time with those who dared to love beyond the rules, who chose to feel despite the consequences. These were the ones who reminded her that there was something greater than survival. There was love, and the love she held for him was her fuel, her fire. The protagonist had not seen him since the night they had shared their secret. That night, when the world had seemed endless and possible, when her heart had raced in sync with his. That night felt like a lifetime ago, a distant memory that was both painful and beautiful, locked away in the vault of her mind. He had slipped away into the night, like smoke that dissolved into the air, leaving only the traces of his touch lingering on her skin. The longing for him grew in her chest, a quiet ache that reverberated through every inch of her body. She had always known the risks of loving someone in a world like this, but she had never fully understood the cost until now. Love, in this broken world, was more than just a forbidden fruit. It was a weapon, a danger, a revolutionary act in itself. To love in a world where emotions were outlawed, where connection was a crime, was to take everything she had and offer it up for destruction. Yet, the longing persisted, gnawing at her from the inside out. She had to see him again. She had to feel his presence beside her, to know that the bond they had forged in the darkness was still alive, still burning. And so, she moved, each step filled with purpose, each breath a prayer that she might find him again, that they might somehow be reunited, even if only for a fleeting moment. The night crept upon the city like a blanket of darkness, thick and suffocating, but to her, it was a comfort. In the cover of night, she could slip through the cracks, unnoticed, unmarked by the regime's watchful eyes. She had learned how to move in silence, how to blend with the shadows, how to make herself invisible to the machines that tracked every movement. But tonight, the air felt different. It was not the usual tension, not the familiar hum of surveillance. There was something more, something in the stillness of the night that made her senses sharper, made her heart beat faster with a mixture of fear and anticipation. She felt as though the city was holding its breath, waiting for something or someone to ignite the spark that would set everything in motion. She reached the place where they had last met, the abandoned building nestled in the heart of the industrial district. Its crumbling walls were a stark contrast to the polished structures of the city's center. Here, in the decay, was the last remaining space where they could be free, where they could dream beyond the regime's reach. She stepped inside, the cold concrete beneath her feet reminding her of the world outside, cold, hard, and unforgiving. Her eyes adjusted to the dim light as she moved deeper into the building. The air was thick with dust, with the memories of those who had come before her, who had fought and fallen in silence. The walls were covered in remnants of the past. Old posters, broken machinery, faded graffiti that whispered of resistance long before her time. And then, in the midst of the silence, she felt it, a presence. It was him. Her heart surged with a mixture of relief and fear. He stood across the room, bathed in the dim light from a cracked window above. His figure was barely visible in the shadows, but there was no mistaking it. It was him, the love she had carried with her through every sleepless night, through every dangerous moment. Her mind raced. She wanted to run to him, to close the distance between them, but something held her back. Fear, yes, but also the understanding that this moment, this fragile moment, was all they could have. There could be no more. The regime's hand was tightening, and their time together was fleeting. But in that silence, in that space between them, there was a shared understanding. They could no longer pretend that the world outside didn't exist. They could no longer pretend that love, in its purest form, was safe. They were both rebels now. He had come to her, not in the hope of saving her, but to save what they could of the world they once believed in. They stood, separated by the shadows, yet bound by the same undeniable truth. Love was the most dangerous weapon they had. And yet, it was the only thing worth fighting for. The moments stretched into eternity as they stood there, knowing that this encounter, this brief moment of peace in a fractured world, was all they had. But in the silence, they also knew that it was enough. Their love, their rebellion, was more than just an act. It was their very existence, a refusal to be broken, a refusal to be erased. With one final glance, they parted ways once more, the promise of what could be, what might never be, lingering in the air between them. The protagonist left the building, her heart heavier than ever, but stronger for the journey ahead. The fight for freedom, for love, was far from over. But for the first time in a long while, she felt that spark of hope flicker again, deep inside. Chapter 10. Unseen forces closing in. The world outside had changed again. The steady rhythm of the city, the hum of machines, the rustle of footsteps, felt louder now, more oppressive than ever. The protagonist moved through it as if in a dream, numb to the noise that filled the air, unaware of the shifting faces and vacant stares. There was only one thing on her mind now, one thought that pulsed with every beat of her heart. The love she had found, the love she had risked everything for. But with every step she took, the weight of that love pressed harder against her chest. She had always known the cost, but now, in the quiet moments between breaths, the reality of their situation felt sharper, more dangerous. She could feel the regime's eyes upon her, always watching, always waiting for the smallest slip, the tiniest hint of defiance. It was a dangerous game they were playing, one that could lead to everything they had fought for being erased in an instant. Yet, as the days stretched into weeks, the longing for him, her love, grew insatiable. It was no longer just a matter of rebellion. It was a matter of survival. Her heart, once hardened by the walls she had built around herself, was now fully exposed. Love had done that. It had torn down the barriers she had spent years constructing and revealed the truth of her own humanity, a truth the regime would never allow. She no longer sought the cold comfort of compliance. She had tasted freedom, and now, with him, she understood that the fight for love was the most important thing she could ever do. But in her heart, she knew there was a high price to be paid for it. Each night, when she returned to her quarters, the stillness of her empty room felt suffocating. The walls closed in on her as she sat alone, staring into the dark, wondering when the next time would come, wondering if she would see him again. Each minute stretched, as though the world itself was holding its breath. The days were becoming harder to endure, each one feeling longer than the last. But in the silence of those nights, she clung to the memories of their last meeting, the way his eyes had held hers, the brief moments they had shared in the shadows of the city. The touch of his hand, the warmth of his presence, was a balm for the fear that threatened to overtake her. She needed him now more than ever, for without him, the world outside seemed an insurmountable wall. It was on one such night, when the weight of solitude felt unbearable, that she received a message. It was not a message in the traditional sense. No letter or words passed from hand to hand, but something far more subtle, far more dangerous. A small object, an innocuous trinket, left at her door. It was a pin, a simple thing, shaped like a broken chain. She knew its meaning immediately, its symbolism clear. It was a signal, a call to action. She was being summoned, though she could not yet understand why or how this moment would change everything. The chain, once broken, was a symbol of freedom. It represented all they had been fighting for, all they hoped to achieve. She felt the stirrings of both fear and excitement within her chest. The stakes were rising. The walls around them were closing in. The time had come for the next step. There could be no turning back. The protagonist left her quarters before the light of day began to leak into the streets. Her movements were swift, sure, each one calculated to avoid detection, yet there was an urgency in her every step. She had no idea where this new message would take her, but she had no choice but to follow it. The world felt heavier now, as though it could collapse at any moment. Yet her resolve, however fragile, remained firm. She had made her choice. She had chosen love over fear. Her journey took her through the familiar streets, but now they felt different, more threatening. The air seemed thicker, the shadows darker. There was a palpable tension in the city, an undercurrent of unrest that she had not sensed before. It was as if everyone, every citizen, was waiting for something to happen, waiting for the spark that would ignite the powder keg that lay beneath their feet. As she reached the edge of the city, the buildings began to thin out, replaced by empty fields and crumbling structures long abandoned. The pin had led her here, but she could not yet see the end of her path. Every turn felt more dangerous, every step a deeper plunge into the unknown. She could hear her own breath, the only sound in the silence that enveloped her. The world had grown quieter, almost as if holding its breath, waiting for the moment when the storm would finally break. It was then that she saw him. He stood in the shadows, barely visible at first, but unmistakable once her eyes found him. Her heart leapt in her chest, the feeling of seeing him again flooding her with warmth, a strange and dangerous comfort in the midst of everything else. He had been waiting for her, just as she had waited for him. Their paths had converged once more, and in that moment, nothing else mattered. He did not speak, and neither did she. Words were no longer necessary. Their shared understanding, the bond they had forged in silence, was enough. In the stillness, they were everything they needed to be. He reached out, his hand brushing against hers in a fleeting touch that sent a shiver through her entire body. The world around them felt irrelevant, distant, as if it had faded into the background. All that remained was the pull between them, the unspoken promise that they would continue to fight for this love, no matter the consequences. But there was no time for prolonged silence. The urgency of the moment, the knowledge that danger was closing in, propelled them forward. They moved quickly, silently, through the crumbling streets, avoiding the gaze of the ever-watchful eyes that hovered above them. Every corner felt like a threat, every step a countdown to discovery. They arrived at a hidden location, a small underground space that seemed to pulse with the energy of rebellion. There were others there, hidden like them, waiting for the next move in the revolution that was slowly taking shape. They had been preparing, gathering strength in the shadows, and now it was time to act. The protagonist and her love stood side by side, their connection stronger than ever, knowing that this was the moment they had been waiting for. The weight of their decision pressed on them both, but in that moment, there was no hesitation. They had chosen each other, and for better or worse, they would continue to choose love, no matter the consequences. As the sounds of distant voices echoed through the tunnels, they knew the world was about to change, and they too would change with it. Chapter 11. A fragile haven. The city, once a symbol of order, now stood as a monument to control. Its towering structures, built from concrete and metal, cast long, jagged shadows across the streets. The protagonist had always known that the regime held power over them, but she hadn't realized the depth of its grip until now. The walls of this world, these walls that had once felt so secure, had begun to feel like a prison, a cage, carefully crafted, designed to keep them inside, to keep them all under control. But she wasn't just anyone. She was different. She had chosen to defy the system, and every day she felt the consequences of that decision. Her every move was now calculated, measured against the potential risks. Even in the most mundane moments, there was a constant awareness of the eyes that watched, the ever-present surveillance that followed. The world had become a web, and she was caught in its threads. Yet, the more tightly the web closed, the more fiercely she fought to escape. And now, in the depths of the city, she had come to understand what rebellion truly meant. It wasn't just the act of defying the rules. It was a series of small, often imperceptible steps towards something greater. Each choice she made now was an act of resistance. Every decision carried weight, each one reverberating through the hidden channels of the underground network. There was no room for weakness, no time for doubt, only the drive to keep moving forward, to keep pushing against the tide. But what she hadn't expected was how the rebellion would pull her in, how the very act of fighting for freedom would begin to transform her. It was no longer just a cause. It was personal. It was a way of life. It had become a battle within herself as much as it was one against the regime. She thought of him, her love, the one who had become the core of everything she now fought for. Every glance, every brush of his hand, had changed her in ways she couldn't explain. He had become her anchor, her reason for daring to stand against everything that had shaped her existence. Without him, without this connection, there was nothing but darkness, and she refused to return to that. But the more she clung to him, the more she realized that the very act of love was an act of rebellion. It was an act that threatened everything the regime stood for. And as the days passed, the world around them began to shift. There were whispers, silent and dangerous, echoing through the underground channels. The regime was tightening its grip. Security measures grew more intrusive, more suffocating. They had always known that this was coming, that the system would fight back harder, faster, but now it was tangible. It was here, and it was impossible to ignore. The protagonist found herself moving through the city with more caution than ever before. Her every step was measured, her eyes scanning the faces around her. The tension in the air was palpable. The city had become a pressure cooker, the simmering heat of revolution on the verge of exploding. She could feel it in her bones. Something was coming, something that would force them all into the open. She had heard rumors of the regime's growing suspicion, the whispered voices that spoke of her name in the shadows. It was only a matter of time before their movements would be detected. She knew the risks. She understood the danger. Yet, she also understood that the longer they remained in the shadows, the more they would be crushed under the weight of the system. They had to act. They had to strike before they were buried. Every day, the underground network grew stronger. The rebels were united in purpose, driven by a singular goal: to take down the system that had held them captive for so long. There was no room for hesitation. They had no choice but to fight, to bring down the walls that separated them from the life they deserved. It was the only way forward. But even in the midst of their growing unity, the protagonist couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, that somewhere, deep within the web of the regime, there were eyes trained on her every move. Her actions were being tracked, cataloged, every step part of a larger plan she couldn't quite see. The tension in the air was suffocating, and she couldn't tell who she could trust anymore. She had trusted once, and that trust had been shattered. She had trusted the system, believed that the world could be understood, that things could be controlled, and that the order of life was as it should be. But now she knew better. The world was nothing like she had imagined. It was full of contradictions, full of lies, full of layers upon layers of deceit. And yet, love had come into her life and shattered everything. Love, that most dangerous of emotions, had changed her. It had made her weak and strong in equal measure. Weak because it had opened her heart to the possibility of loss, to the devastating vulnerability that came with caring for someone else. But strong, too, because it had given her the courage to fight, to stand up for what was right. It was that love that brought her to the edge of the city once again. The outskirts were quieter now, the streets more desolate. Fewer people wandered the alleyways, fewer eyes turned in her direction. And though there was still a sense of danger that hung in the air like a storm waiting to break, she knew that she had to meet him again. They had to speak, even if they couldn't say a word. Their connection was enough. The place they met was always the same, an abandoned building on the edge of the city, far from the watchful eyes of the authorities. There was something about the isolation of it that felt right, something that made it feel like a sanctuary, even if it was temporary. The silence between them was always heavy, but it was comfortable. There was a deeper understanding now, a bond forged through shared risk and the unspoken weight of their love. She knew they couldn't stay hidden forever. Their time was running out. The revolution was on the cusp of breaking free, but that very act of rebellion would bring them to the attention of the regime. Every move they made would be watched. Every choice would carry consequences. The protagonist felt it in her heart. The battle ahead was coming. The struggle was about to become real, and the stakes had never been higher. For herself, for him, for all of them, they had made the choice, and now there was no turning back. Chapter 12. The Price of Yearning. The world outside was bathed in the harsh glow of artificial light, as it always was. The skyline of the city stood unmoving, cold and indifferent to the struggles below. Everything seemed to hum with the same sterile energy, a constant undercurrent of control. The protagonist moved through the streets, but nothing felt familiar anymore. Her steps felt heavy, her heart weighed down by the enormity of the choices that loomed over her. Every corner of the city had become a reminder of what they were up against. The omnipresent surveillance, the faceless guards who moved like shadows through the streets, the advertisements and signs that plastered every wall. All of it served to reinforce the same message: conformity. The regime had taken everything: choice, freedom, love. It had reduced them to mere cogs in a machine, all part of a predetermined system that left no room for anything outside the lines. But she had crossed that line. She could feel it in every part of her, this growing desire to break free, to shatter the boundaries that had been imposed on her from birth. She no longer recognized herself in the person the system had tried to shape. The rebellion had changed her, as it had changed everyone who dared to defy the rules. She had always been a quiet observer, someone who took in the world with an analytical mind. But now, it felt like the very foundation of her existence had been cracked open, and in its place, something new had emerged. Something that longed for more than just survival. It longed for freedom. And the most dangerous thing of all was that it longed for love. She had always known that love was forbidden, that it was something that could not be allowed to exist in a world like this. Emotions were to be suppressed, controlled, erased if necessary. Yet, in the deepest parts of her heart, she had found that love was the one thing that made her feel alive. It was the only thing that made her feel human in a world that tried so hard to dehumanize them all. She thought of him, her love, the one who had become her reason for everything. He had sparked something in her, a fire that could not be extinguished. They had met in secret, in the shadows of the city, and yet every moment they shared had been filled with a depth of emotion that defied everything they had been taught. It wasn't just an act of rebellion. It was an act of defiance against the very core of their society, a society that had taught them to fear and suppress the most powerful force of all. The deeper she delved into her feelings, the more she understood that love was both the weapon and the weakness of their fight. It made them strong in ways that the regime couldn't even begin to comprehend. It made them willing to do the impossible. And yet, it also made them vulnerable. It was a secret that could destroy them both, a secret that had already begun to unravel the world around them. She had been running from the authorities for weeks now, and every moment she spent on the run only added to the weight of the decisions she had made. She had seen the cracks in the system, felt the tremors of something larger taking shape, but she couldn't escape the feeling that it was all moving too quickly, too dangerously. Each day felt like a countdown, and with each passing hour, the stakes grew higher. The hidden network of rebels had grown stronger, their operations more daring. But even with their numbers increasing, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were playing a dangerous game. The regime had spies everywhere. There was nowhere that was truly safe. The underground was a fragile thing, held together by trust that was becoming harder and harder to maintain. She had seen betrayal before. She knew that in times of desperation, people could turn on each other. Yet, in spite of the risk, she felt herself pulled toward him more strongly than ever. There was something in his eyes, something in the way he looked at her that made her believe that they could win, that they could bring down the system. But there was no illusion of ease. The cost would be great. They were playing a game where there were no winners, only survivors. Her mind raced as she navigated the city streets, avoiding the checkpoints, the scanning devices that could track her with terrifying precision. Every corner was a potential trap, every person a possible threat. But she could not bring herself to stop. She had come too far, and there was no turning back now. The danger, the fear, it all felt distant in comparison to the pull of something far greater. She was driven by a vision of the future, a world where they could live without fear, where love was not a crime. It was an ideal that she had begun to dream of when they first met, and now it was a vision that she could not let go. The air grew colder as she made her way to their meeting place, an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. She had been here countless times before, but tonight the weight of the moment felt heavier than ever. She knew that the walls of their secret world were closing in. The regime was tightening its hold on every corner of the city, and soon, it would become impossible to hide. There was no more time for preparation, no more time for planning. The revolution was coming, and they would either be part of it or crushed beneath it. Her heart raced as she stepped into the warehouse, the familiar scent of dust and decay filling the air. The shadows seemed deeper here, more oppressive, but they were not alone. They never were. The rebels, their comrades, their allies, were scattered in every corner, working in silence, planning in the dark. The faint hum of machinery filled the space, a reminder that everything they had worked for had led to this moment. And then, she saw him. The moment their eyes met, everything else fell away. The world, with all its chaos and danger, seemed to fade into nothingness. In his gaze, she saw the same unspoken understanding that had always existed between them. They were no longer two separate people caught in a system that sought to tear them apart. They were something greater now, something powerful, something that could not be stopped. But even as the connection between them deepened, there was a gnawing fear at the edges of her mind. The weight of the choice that lay ahead pressed against her chest like a stone. She knew what had to be done, but was she ready? Were they ready? As they stood in the shadowed warehouse, surrounded by the growing forces of rebellion, the protagonist knew that they were on the precipice of something monumental. This was no longer just about them, no longer just about their love. This was about the future of everything. The choice before her was one that could change the course of their world. It could bring them victory, or it could lead them to destruction. The weight of that choice hung in the air, thick and suffocating, as she made her decision. Chapter 13. Into the heart of the storm. The days following the decision felt like a blur, a haze of urgency and silent anticipation. It was as though the world had paused, holding its breath, waiting for the storm that was soon to arrive. The city, once a place she had known so well, had become unrecognizable, a labyrinth of shadows, hidden paths, and whispered secrets. Every step she took, every breath she drew, was weighted with the knowledge that nothing would ever be the same again. There was no going back now. The protagonist moved through the city with a new sense of determination, her footsteps purposeful, her eyes scanning the surroundings with a sharpness that had not been there before. The time for hesitation had passed. Her heart still beat in frantic rhythms, but her mind was focused, clear, on the task ahead. The weight of their shared secret had grown heavier, but so too had the fire that burned within her. Every action, every plan they made, was a defiance of the world they had once known. The plan they had set in motion was risky, almost reckless. But what choice did they have? They were cornered, caught in a world that sought to crush them, and this was their only chance. She had no illusions of easy victories. Every movement they made in the underground, every attempt to break free from the system, came with a price. The risks were so high that even the smallest misstep could mean the end of everything they had fought for. It was not just their lives on the line anymore. It was the lives of everyone who had believed in the cause, everyone who had dared to stand up against the regime. She thought of him constantly. His face, his eyes, haunted her in every waking moment, his presence a constant pull in her chest. She knew what they were doing was dangerous, but the alternative was worse. To live in a world where they were not free, where love was a crime. No, she could not accept that. Not anymore. She had tasted something beyond the cold, sterile existence that the regime imposed, and it was too powerful to let go. Their love had become more than just a personal rebellion. It was now a symbol of everything they stood for. Their feelings for each other had become a weapon, a rallying cry in the fight against the oppression that had torn their world apart. But with that power came the danger, the knowledge that they were risking everything. They had been careful, kept their meetings brief, their conversations encrypted and indirect. But as the days passed, it became harder to keep the distance. The tension between them grew, as did the longing for something they could never fully have. The underground had become their only refuge, a place where they could exist outside the prying eyes of the regime. But even there, safety was an illusion. The movement was swelling in numbers, but it was also growing in danger. The regime was becoming more aggressive, tightening its grip on every aspect of life. And the underground had to move swiftly, its actions more calculated and desperate than ever before. It was on one of these days, as she slipped through the hidden pathways of the city, that she felt it. The shift. A momentary lapse in the rhythm of the world around her. A crack in the facade. For a split second, the air felt thicker, charged with an energy that she could not quite place. It was a sensation she had learned to recognize. The presence of the regime's forces closing in. She moved faster, blending into the crowd, her heart pounding as she passed through the streets. The faceless soldiers in their dark uniforms patrolled, their eyes scanning every face, every movement with suspicion. The city had become a prison, and they were all prisoners, trapped by the invisible bars of the regime's control. But the protagonist refused to let fear take hold. She had come too far. She had chosen this path, and she would not falter. As she neared their safe house, the familiar weight of the old, crumbling building seemed to offer her some comfort. It had been a sanctuary in a world that offered none. She had come to rely on these fleeting moments of safety, these spaces where she could breathe, even if only for a short time. Inside, the underground operatives worked in silence, the hum of machinery and the rustle of papers the only sounds that broke the stillness. Everyone was on edge, everyone aware of the growing danger. She was not alone in her anxiety. The rebels, those who had joined the cause, all felt it. The pressure mounting, the looming sense of impending disaster. They had been fighting for so long, but now, it seemed that the walls were closing in. It was becoming harder to find new routes, harder to communicate without fear of being intercepted. The regime was everywhere, watching, listening, waiting, and yet there was still hope. It burned in the eyes of those who had dared to take a stand. It was fragile, yes, but it was there. The hope that their rebellion would not be in vain. That love, though forbidden, could somehow become the spark that ignited a fire strong enough to burn through the regime's iron grip. As the protagonist stepped into the dim light of the safe house, her eyes immediately found him. The familiar presence of her love anchored her, even as the world around them seemed to collapse. He was already looking at her, his gaze intense and unreadable, but there was something more in it now. The distance that had once kept them apart was narrowing, the barrier of secrecy slowly dissolving. They didn't need to speak. There were no words that could capture what was shared between them in that moment. It was in the way their eyes locked, in the way their breaths seemed to synchronize. It was the understanding that this fight, this rebellion, was not just for the future. It was for them, for their love, for the possibility of something better. But even as the connection between them deepened, the weight of their decisions loomed larger. They both knew the risks they were taking, and yet neither of them could bring themselves to stop. The rebellion was at a crossroads. The next steps would determine everything. It would either spark the revolution they had fought for, or it would lead to their undoing. But in the quiet moments they shared, in the stolen seconds when they were allowed to simply exist together, there was no hesitation. There was only the certainty that they had made the right choice. For love, for freedom, for the chance to live. But the storm was coming, and they would face it together. Chapter 14. The Breaking Point. The air was thick with anticipation, every heartbeat a drum that echoed in the quiet spaces of the safe house. The weight of what was to come settled heavily on her shoulders, more oppressive than the regime ever could be. Time had begun to warp, its once clear passage now a blur of moments, each one sharper than the last, each one carrying with it the burden of decisions made. Outside, the city carried on with its muted rhythm, silent, mechanical, like the gears of a machine. But inside, the walls of their refuge seemed to close in on her, pressing down, urging her to move faster, to think clearer, to act. Every creak of the floorboards beneath her feet felt like a warning, every rustle of paper or flicker of a light an ominous sign. It was the stillness that terrified her the most, the anticipation of something unseen, but inevitable. The tension had been building for days, as though the world around them was holding its breath, waiting for something to break. Every encounter, every fleeting moment of peace, now seemed like the calm before a storm. She could feel it deep in her bones, a gnawing sensation that something was going to happen soon, something they could not control. The underground had grown restless. The movement was no longer a whisper in the shadows. It was louder now, bolder. People spoke of change, of action, of rebellion. But each of those words carried a price, one that many of them were not fully prepared to pay. The lines between victory and defeat had blurred. She had seen the faces of the others, those who had joined the cause, those who had put their faith in the movement. Their eyes were filled with the same uncertainty she felt, but they also carried the same spark of hope. Hope that they could bring about a future, not just for themselves, but for everyone who had suffered under the regime's oppressive rule. But the price for that hope was steep. It was a price they had all agreed to pay, even if they had no idea what it would truly cost them. Each step they took forward was a risk, each plan they devised more dangerous than the last. She had always known that defying the system would bring consequences, But the gravity of those consequences was beginning to settle in her chest like a stone. There would be no turning back now. As the days stretched on, she began to see how fragile everything was. The connections she had forged in the underground, the bonds they had all formed in their shared struggle, now felt like a fragile thread, one that could snap at any moment. The faces of those who had trusted her, who had followed her lead, were becoming harder to distinguish from the faces of the enemy. How long would they be able to survive this game of cat and mouse? How much longer could they keep their secret? She had never been one to shrink from a challenge, but this was different. This was no longer just about the fight for a better world. It was about survival. It was about staying alive long enough to see that world come to fruition. It was about holding on to the smallest piece of themselves in a world that had taken everything else. And through it all, there was him. Her heart quickened whenever his image appeared in her thoughts, an image that was both a comfort and a torment. Their love had always been something stolen, something secret, something that had to be hidden in the cracks of a world that sought to crush it. Yet it was also something beautiful, something pure amidst the darkness. Their connection, fragile as it was, felt like the only truth in a world built on lies. It was the thing that kept her going, the thing that made every sacrifice worth it. She had never known anything like it, never thought it was possible to love with such depth, with such certainty, in a world that forbade it. But the closer they drew to the storm, the more dangerous their love became. The authorities were everywhere. Their presence was like a shadow, a specter that loomed over every interaction, every exchange. It was only a matter of time before the walls would close in on them. They had made the decision to fight, to resist, and now they would have to face the consequences of that decision. The authorities were relentless. The regime's soldiers were closing in on the underground, and soon, there would be no place left to hide. The safe house, the only place that had given them some measure of peace, would no longer be safe. She could feel it, the inevitable collapse of their carefully constructed world. She had seen the reports from the others, heard the whispers of the regime's movements. They were tightening the net, making their move. The time for subtlety was over. The time for silence had passed. Now, it was time for action. They would have to strike first, or they would be caught in the crossfire. It was a choice that carried the weight of their lives, their futures, and everything they had worked for. She knew that this would be the breaking point, the moment when everything they had fought for would either be realized or destroyed. The underground had been preparing for this. The plans had been made, the routes mapped out. Everyone knew their role. And yet, even as the plan took shape, there was no comfort in knowing what was to come. There was no certainty, only the raw, unyielding knowledge that they were stepping into the unknown, that the future they had dreamed of was still a fragile, unformed thing. And yet, as she prepared herself for the next step, she felt a strange sense of calm. The tension, the anxiety, the uncertainty, it all seemed to fade in the face of what was about to happen. She had never wanted to be a hero. She had never wanted to be a symbol. But she was no longer just the girl who had dreamed of something better. She was the girl who had chosen to fight for it. And now, there was nothing left to do but fight. And through it all, there was him. His image remained, a beacon in the darkness, a reminder of why they were doing this. The thought of him steadied her, gave her strength in the moments when fear threatened to take over. The storm was coming. The battle was about to begin, and she would face it, not just for herself, but for him, for their love, and for the future they still believed in. Chapter 15. The Choice of the Heart. The world outside had grown cold. The sky a dull gray that seemed to reflect the weight of everything that had led to this moment. There was no sun anymore, only the oppressive silence that hung like a shroud over the city. The sounds of the world had been muted, nothing but distant hums and mechanical drones of the regime's machines. enforcing the control they so desperately sought to maintain. She stood by the window, staring into the abyss of a city that had once felt alive, now reduced to a prison of conformity. The walls outside had begun to close in, just as she had known they would. The hidden pathways, the secret escapes, the places that had once offered fleeting moments of freedom were now traps, places of no return. The authorities had grown too efficient, too relentless, and time was running out. Her breath came in shallow bursts, fogging up the window as her thoughts churned like a storm within her mind. She had made the decision, just as she had promised herself she would. There was no turning back now. Every step had led her here. Every choice, every risk, every stolen moment. But now, as the weight of everything they had fought for pressed down on her, she wondered if they had chosen the right path. She wondered if their love, the one thing they had kept hidden from the world, would be enough to carry them through this. The echo of a distant door creaking caught her attention, and her body tensed. She didn't need to turn around to know who it was. She had known, deep in her soul, that he would come to her when the time was right. And the time had come. There was no more room for hesitation. No more time to dwell on what could go wrong. Only time for action. She didn't have to look at him to feel the pull of their connection, the invisible thread that had tethered them together from the moment they had first crossed paths. It had always been there, silent and strong, unspoken but undeniable, a connection that defied everything the world had tried to impose on them. She had thought once that love in such a world would be impossible, that something as raw, as pure as love would have no place in the sterile order of their society. But the truth had been different. Love had thrived despite the walls they had built, despite the rules that had sought to bind them. And now, that love was their most dangerous weapon. He stepped closer to her, his presence like a shadow, always just behind her, always there, always a part of her. She felt him without needing to see him. He didn't need to speak for her to know what was in his heart. She could feel it as clearly as her own pulse. This moment, this unbearable stillness, was the culmination of everything. It was the point of no return, the moment where the choice would be made, and the consequences would be sealed. The choice was no longer just hers. It was theirs. Together, they had to decide how much they were willing to sacrifice. Their love, their rebellion, their freedom, they all hung in the balance. One false move, one misstep, and everything could come crashing down. But standing here, in the presence of the one person who had shared in this fight, she knew that she could not face this alone. The plan was simple, but its execution would be anything but. It had been drawn out carefully, meticulously, every detail considered. They knew what needed to be done, where they needed to go, and when they had to act. But nothing could account for the uncertainty in their hearts, the fear that lingered in the corners of their minds. What if it didn't work? What if the regime was one step ahead? What if this was the end of the line? But deep inside, beyond the fear, beyond the doubts, was a quiet strength, a determination that had always been there, guiding her. She had come too far to turn back. His hand brushed hers, the touch light but grounding. The gesture, so small, yet so powerful, reminded her of what was at stake. Their love had always been a spark in the darkness, a fire that burned brightly despite the world around them trying to snuff it out. And now, it was the only thing they had left to hold on to. Her heart swelled with a mixture of fear and resolve. She thought about the countless nights they had spent planning, preparing, dreaming of the future they could never have, dreams of a world where love wasn't a crime, where they weren't forced to live in the shadows. They had both given everything to this cause, sacrificed pieces of themselves along the way. But now, it wasn't just a matter of survival. Now, it was a matter of taking everything they had worked for, everything they had lost, and turning it into something that could change the world. She reached for him then, a slow, deliberate motion, and her fingers found his. It was the simplest of actions, yet it felt like everything. The affirmation of their bond, of their commitment to each other, of their willingness to face whatever would come. The moment stretched on, timeless in its intensity. They stood there together, side by side, knowing that what came next would change everything. The weight of the decision loomed large, and yet there was a sense of calm between them. A quiet understanding that no matter what the future held, they had each other. And that, in itself, was a victory. The door of the safe house creaked open, the sound like a death knell, signaling the end of their time in hiding. Their time was up. They couldn't wait any longer. It was time to leave this place, to step into the unknown, to risk everything for a chance at a better world. They exchanged one last look, a look that said everything words could not. And then, without hesitation, they turned and walked into the darkness together. The world outside might have been cold, unforgiving, but in that moment, they had each other. And that was enough to carry them forward, no matter what the world had in store. Chapter 16. A World Reborn. The city felt different that day, strange, as if the very air had shifted, holding its breath for the first time in years. The streets, so often lifeless and controlled, now felt like an open expanse. The silence was deeper, more profound, as though even the walls themselves had become aware of the seismic changes underway. There were no sounds of the usual patrols, no mechanical hum of the regime's constant surveillance. In their place, a quiet stillness hung over the city like a fragile veil, one that threatened to be torn apart at any moment. She felt it first, the weight of the change, as she and he moved through the streets. It wasn't just the lack of sound. It was the absence of the fear that had once seeped into every corner of their lives. Fear of being caught, fear of being punished, fear of never knowing true freedom. And yet, now, the fear seemed distant. They had moved past it, surpassed it, in a way. They walked side by side, the rhythm of their steps synchronized, as they made their way toward the heart of the city, the place where everything had started, where the seed of rebellion had been planted. The heart of the regime's power was no longer the looming structure it had once been. It was simply a building now, a place of cold, calculated oppression that no longer held sway over their lives. They could feel the gravity of their mission pressing in on them. But in the pit of their stomachs, there was also something else: hope. The kind of hope they hadn't dared to feel for years. Hope that, despite everything, something good could come from this. Hope that love could still change the world. The journey had been long, filled with shadows and the constant threat of discovery. They had barely escaped the prying eyes of the regime's enforcers, slipping through hidden passages and underground tunnels, risking everything to get here. Every step had been a step toward this moment, a moment they had fought for, bled for, and lost pieces of themselves for. But now, with the weight of their choices pressing upon them, it was impossible to ignore the significance of what they were about to do. As they reached the central square, the place where the regime's broadcasts had once been aired for all to see, there was no turning back. The space was empty now, abandoned, save for a few scattered remnants of the system they had fought so hard to tear down. Broken screens, fallen banners, the remnants of a past life. He reached for her hand then, his touch steady and warm, grounding her. They had come so far, crossed so many lines, risked so much. There was no more pretending, no more hiding. The truth was before them, waiting to be embraced. Together, they stepped into the center of the square, standing side by side, facing the remnants of the regime's power. There was nothing left to say, nothing to do but act. The world was watching, though they couldn't see it. It didn't matter anymore. The only thing that mattered was this moment of truth, of defiance, of love. The world that had once been dominated by fear, by oppression, was crumbling before their eyes. They had worked for this, bled for this, and now, with the end of the regime within reach, they were ready to rewrite the story. They would be the ones to change the world, to give it back the humanity it had lost. Her breath caught in her throat as she looked around them, the weight of the moment settling deep into her bones. This wasn't just the end of a regime. It was the beginning of something new. A world where emotions would no longer be outlawed. A world where love could be spoken openly, without fear, without consequence. A world where rebellion would no longer be a crime. Where freedom could flourish once again. They had chosen this. Chosen to fight. Chosen to love. And now, they would reap the rewards of that choice. With one final, determined look at him, she let go of all the doubts, all the fears, and all the shadows of the past. It was time to take what was theirs, to claim the future they had always dreamed of, to step into a world where they were no longer prisoners of a cold, heartless regime, but free to love, to live, to be. Together, they raised their hands to the sky, a symbol of unity, of defiance, of love. The air around them seemed to crackle with energy, the promise of change coursing through their veins. And in that moment, it was as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for the next chapter to unfold. The winds began to stir, as if the city itself were coming alive, shaking off the weight of years of oppression. The sky, once a dull gray, now seemed to pulse with light, as if the very heavens were responding to the power of their love, to the power of their rebellion. And then, as the first rays of sunlight began to break through the clouds, casting a golden glow over the square, they knew it was done. The world was reborn. A new era had begun. They had won. Chapter 17. The Dawn of Freedom. The city that had once been a cage, a place where every step, every breath was controlled by the oppressive regime, was now an open expanse filled with the promise of new beginnings. The world had shifted, the foundation of the old system shattered beyond repair. The regime, once an immovable force, had crumbled in the wake of their actions, and now there was only the quiet aftermath of their rebellion. A world left to be rebuilt, to be reimagined. She stood at the edge of the square, her eyes taking in the vastness of it all, her heart pounding in her chest. The air felt different now, lighter, as if it too had been freed from the weight of the years. No longer did it carry the sting of fear, of suffocation, but instead, it was filled with the scent of possibility. The sky above was no longer a dull gray, but a vibrant blue, stretching endlessly above them. For the first time in what felt like forever, the sun shone brightly, casting warmth across the land. They had done it. Against all odds, they had done it. The regime that had sought to control every thought, every feeling, every heartbeat, was no more. And in its place was a world waiting to be claimed, waiting to be loved. Her hand instinctively reached out, fingers brushing against the wind. The breeze was gentle, a silent whisper of the new life that awaited them. A world where emotions were no longer shackles but the very essence of being. In this new world, love would no longer be hidden in shadows, whispered in secrecy. It would be celebrated, allowed to flourish freely, without fear of punishment. No longer would love be a crime, rebellion be a sin. She glanced to her side, where he stood, his gaze fixed on the horizon. His presence, steady and unwavering, was a constant reminder of what they had fought for. He was the reason she had dared to hope, the reason she had chosen to defy the rules that sought to suppress the most human of emotions. Together, they had dared to love in a world that told them it was impossible. And now, as the last remnants of the old world crumbled away, they stood at the precipice of something entirely new. A soft sound broke the silence, the faintest hint of movement among the rubble. It was the first of many. Slowly, as if rising from the ashes, others began to emerge. Citizens, once hidden in fear, now stepping into the light. They too had lived in the shadows, afraid to show their true selves, afraid to feel the emotions that had been so harshly repressed. But now, the air was different, and they could breathe again. They could stand tall, no longer ashamed of their humanity, no longer afraid of their own hearts. One by one, the people began to gather in the square, their faces uncertain but hopeful. It was not a moment of sudden change, but a slow unfolding. The old ways were not erased in an instant. It would take time to heal the wounds that had been carved into the fabric of society. But the first step had been taken. The first breath of freedom had been drawn. She watched as people turned to one another, their expressions shifting, softening. There was no immediate celebration, no loud cheers or exclamations. There was simply the shared recognition of a truth that had been hidden for so long. They were free. She felt it, too, the quiet power of freedom, the sense that the world was waking up, shaking off its chains, stretching toward something brighter. And yet, despite the weight of everything they had fought for, she couldn't help but feel the weight of the silence, the vast, uncertain future that lay ahead. The world they had created, the world they had saved, was not a perfect one. There would be struggles ahead, just as there had been struggles to get here. But it would be their world, a world where they could love without fear, where the choices they made would be their own. He turned to her then, his eyes filled with something that could only be called hope. The fire that had burned within them both, the fire that had fueled their every action, was now a steady, warm glow. They had done what they set out to do. Freedom had been restored. And in the quiet, in the calm that followed the storm, they could finally begin to rebuild together. She reached out then, her fingers brushing against his once more. And in that simple touch, in the quiet of the world around them, they understood. There was no need for words, no need for grand gestures. The revolution had been won, and love had conquered all. They had taken down the walls that separated them, the walls that separated everyone, and now the world could begin again. They stood there together, hand in hand, as the first light of dawn began to break over the horizon. The sun, long hidden by the shadow of the regime, now rose to meet them, casting golden rays over the square. The world was waking up, and this time it would be different. In the distance, the sounds of the city began to return. The hum of machinery, the voices of people, the life of the world that had been stifled for so long. But now, it was a different kind of life, a life filled with possibility. The future was no longer something to be feared. It was something to be embraced, something to be shaped by those who had fought to make it a reality. And as they stood there, watching the dawn break over the city, they knew that this was only the beginning. They had fought for this moment, for the freedom to love, to live, to be. The world had been reborn, and it was theirs to shape.